Today on CityCast Philly, the 2024 presidential election cycle took a turn recently when President Joe Biden announced he wasn't running for re-election and endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris as the Democratic candidate. While that's not official just yet, there's been talk about who could be her running mate. I'm speaking with two political reporters about how likely it is that Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro gets picked for vice president. It's Thursday, July 25th. I'm Trinae Nuri, and here's what Philly's talking about. Stephen Caruso, state capitol reporter for Spotlight PA. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to talk.
Stephen, let's start with the basics here. Who is Governor Josh Shapiro?
So Josh Shapiro, he is 51 years old. He is Pennsylvania's governor. He was elected in 2022, and he has held pretty much every position under the sun that you can imagine in government.
Okay.
He was a congressional staffer. He was a state representative. He was a county commissioner. Then he was attorney general, and that's how he's become governor. So he's been climbing the ladder of Pennsylvania politics very dutifully, basically for the last 2 decades. And that's how he's ended up as the chief executive of our state.
Now, where does Governor Josh Shapiro stand on policies that he's openly supported? And tell me about some laws he's signed and overall accomplishments so far in his political career.
A lot of his accomplishments have come as Attorney General. He's become very well known for a grand jury report he released in 2018 that documented abuse by Catholic priests of young people, of children, of teens. He also spent a lot of time challenging Donald Trump's actions in courts, from elections to environmental laws to abortion access. As governor, he's been working with a split General Assembly. He will happily tell you how he's the only governor who has to deal with a Republican chamber and a Democratic chamber at the same time. And that is difficult, but it has meant that his legislative accomplishments, it isn't the thickest book. But I can tell you, in his 2 budgets that he's negotiated, education spending has gone up by about 20%, a little less than that, which was something he's prioritized. A lot of laws have passed under his governorship and that he's been able to sign, such as a texting while driving ban that folks have advocated for. His budgets have also included more money for economic development, an issue he's prioritized, some expansion to state healthcare spending, and in general, I would say it's been a lot of working around the edges of divided government that he's hung his hat on.
So what policies has he been able to focus on so far as governor?
Well, and that goes back to, we have a divided General Assembly. So it's the list of legislative accomplishments, it's mostly concentrated in his spending plans. Education funding is a big one, but even then, advocates will tell you it hasn't been enough to answer the 2023 court ruling that said we're unconstitutionally underfunding schools. I would say, though, there have been some wins on housing that I know progressives are really happy with. I think economic development, in particular, a trade this year that got Shapiro his extra money to help set up sites for new development in exchange for some permitting reform, basically making it, I've had it compared to me as like the permitting equivalent of getting the fast pass at Disneyland. I think that was a bipartisan win. But I think other than that, it has been a tricky 2 years in the legislature. So I don't know if Shapiro has as thick a list of accomplishments as, say, a Governor Tim Walz, a Governor Gretchen Whitmer, or some of the other folks who have sometimes been talked about in this conversation for VP.
Also, speaking of his accomplishments, he had a really speedy response here in Philadelphia with the 95 bridge collapse.
Yeah, and that's by far, I think, one of his biggest nationally known accomplishments. The I-95 bridge up in Northeast Philly collapsed. He organized a replacement of it that took, I think, 2 weeks or so, as people were paying a lot of attention to this. He emphasizes that a lot. That's a big part of his GSD,
yes.
Get shit done. What he says is his legacy of trying to get things done. And I should say, too, he also had to respond to the East Palestine train disaster. That was about 2 weeks into his time in the governor's office. And he's even been on the national stage because the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump's life out in Butler County earlier this month. All of these are sort of situations he had to handle. And I think he's received really high marks from national figures and bipartisan acknowledgement that he's really been a statesman in those situations.
All right, Stephen, what about any controversies we should know about?
Well, controversies would be the biggest one, the most obvious one is he had a former aide, Mike Verb, who had to resign for sexual harassment allegations, after which there was a settlement that was given to him, a taxpayer funded settlement. Sort of as reporters started getting and picking up on the story, outlets that included myself and other reporters, they suddenly announced he was gone and there was a settlement. I think we're still working through, what has happened with that. But other than that, too, on his positions, a really big one on education is the governor is a supporter of private schooling. He supports school vouchers. He said this during his campaign in 2022. And he tried to get that into the 2023 budget, but it actually had to be pulled out after Democrats who controlled the House with their one vote majority refused to pass the budget with that in it. And he ended up having to veto that proposal. So that was also kind of a big deal at the time, and I think is still hanging over his candidacy. And I would also be remiss to add Josh Shapiro, who is, I think, one of the highest profile Jewish politicians in the country. He's also been made very clear he supports Israel's right to exist. He supports a two-state solution. He has been critical of PM Benjamin Netanyahu, but as sort of the politics over the war in Gaza, royal Pennsylvania, and national politics, he has been very clear in his support for Israel and his right to defend itself. And that has brought him criticism from some folks on the left who argue that he has not stood up against Israel. He's not called for a ceasefire and issues on that.
So why is Shapiro reportedly being considered for vice president and even on this short list?
And I think that goes back to, he won in 2022, and granted, this was against a weak opponent, Doug Mastriano, but he won by 14 points. That's a landslide in a swing state like Pennsylvania. I would simply say, look, Shapiro's polished. He's a good fundraiser. He is always on message. I've had him described as disciplined, if not calculating, whichever one you prefer. He is a politician. He is the consummate politician who, knows how to talk to people, knows how to relate to people. Josh Shapiro hasn't lost a race since he entered politics back in the 2000s. So I think the interest in him is, does he help the nationwide Kamala Harris ticket in Pennsylvania? And does it also help Democrats lower down on the ballot succeed in Pennsylvania in this really key election? And also, it's important to note, he is ambitious. I think that's been known. He is always hesitant to show that ambition, but everyone around him and everyone who interacts with him in Harrisburg is very aware of this. So I think there is some mutual interest in seeing what would Josh Shapiro look like in the national spotlight.
That's Stephen Caruso, state capitol reporter for Spotlight PA. Stephen, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
We've got more on this story after the break.
Hi, I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast. The best way to learn a language is immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day. That's how I learned French as a kid. But if that's not in the cards for you this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I live in a city with a huge immigrant population. You probably do too. And in my hometown, a lot of my new neighbors speak Spanish as a first language, and we have lots of great Mexican and Central American and South American restaurants and stores. I wanted to be able to communicate just a little bit better with some of my neighbors. So I started with Babbel, the science-backed language learning app that actually works. And after just a few extremely enjoyable weeks learning Spanish with Babbel, I've already gotten comfortable ordering at a restaurant and eavesdropping on my girlfriend's conversations with her mom. Look, learning a language isn't always easy, but with Babbel it is fun and it feels useful, basically immediately. That's why Babbel has over 16 million subscriptions sold. Plus, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for CityCast listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners at babbel.com/citycast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/citycast. Spelled BABBEL.com/citycast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
We just learned about who Governor Shapiro is and his record so far. Now, let's talk about who he is on a national stage. We're going to bring in Julia Taruso, political reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Hey, Julia.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Okay, so why might Shapiro make sense for Harris as the likely candidate? And for Democrats at large, since we've seen so much flux?
Oh, a lot of flux. I think the first word to start with is Pennsylvania. From the moment that this campaign started, it has been laser focused on Pennsylvania. When it was Biden's campaign, the campaign basically admitted that their path to victory is the blue wall, which is Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Pennsylvania is largely seen as the most important of those three states, just because it has been won by such slim margins and it keeps kind of fluctuating. And while, there's a lot of question about how much a vice president actually impacts how people vote, in such an unprecedented election with just 3 months to go, or a little more than 3 months, I think some people see putting Shapiro on the ticket as a real opportunity to lock down Pennsylvania. I don't know if that would be the case, but if you can make that argument, then it makes the argument for him really, really strong. Other reasons, he is seen as something of a bipartisan Democrat. He won in 2022 with a lot of support from more moderate Republicans, from independents, from parts of the state that could decide Pennsylvania and could in some ways decide this election. We're talking about counties that are, Republican red counties, but that he really drove up Democratic margins in. I think some of the moments when he's been on the national stage, he's shown that he's a kind of polished communicator who a lot of people see as someone who would round out the ticket well for her.
Pennsylvanians know him, but would he appeal to and energize Americans?
I think that's an excellent question. I think that the conversation we are having right now is a conversation that people on radio shows in North Carolina are having about Roy Cooper, and that they're having in Arizona, and that, every governor and person who's being considered for vice president, and there is a list that includes, 4 or 5 people other than Shapiro.
Mostly from swing states.
Mostly from swing states, though, yes. I think they're all kind of thinking they've got the guy, because we are largely talking about a guy, and wondering, but do people outside of my state know who this person is? And depending on who you talk to, they say, yeah, sure, Shapiro has a national profile. But some people admit, outside of Pennsylvania, it's not quite as prolific as we may think, as he may think.
So are there reasons why Shapiro isn't a good fit for the ticket? Like, is this the moment?
I think that the other thing we know about Governor Shapiro is that he is a very methodical person, and he is someone who we have known to have political ambitions for quite some time. So this was not the plan. His plan, all from everything we can tell, was, to kind of assemble his team, his record, and look to 2028. So I think there's 2 questions. Is it the right time for the party to have Shapiro as vice president, and is it the right time for him politically? And while most people I've spoken to say, if he's offered this, he would be crazy to take it. That is a calculation that he's going to have to make, is if it's smart politically in this moment for him.
Julia, has he said anything about his interest in this job?
So there was a press conference on Monday,
yes,
and he did not deny or acknowledge interest in the job. And that's sort of been the way that he's been playing this. He has a lot of Democrats, particularly in Philadelphia, going to bat for him. The party chair, Bob Brady, basically said, Josh is our guy. I'm going to tell everybody I can that he should be our guy. And typically, if a politician does not want that to be happening, they will wave that off behind the scenes. So while he has made no public statement except to say that it is a very personal decision and that he wants to wait to see what the vice president decides, the current vice president, he hasn't, publicly acknowledged if he wants the job.
Now, let's talk about what's at stake, though, for PA. Either way, if he does get asked and does accept, what's the timeline for the transition of power? And does he get to stay on as governor during this campaign run?
So Democrats are trying to move fast. Harris's campaign is trying to move fast to pick a vice president. That could happen anytime in the next 3 weeks before the Democratic National Convention in late August. If Shapiro is picked to be her running mate, he can remain governor of Pennsylvania while campaigning. But if the ticket wins, if the Democrats win, then he would have to step down as governor, and Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis would become governor of the state. So that would be around inauguration in January.
That was Julia Taruso, political reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thanks, Julia.
Thanks.
That's all for today here on CityCast Philly. If you enjoyed this episode, tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to sign up for our morning newsletter, Hey Philly, to learn more about what else Philly's talking about. We'll be back tomorrow morning with the Friday News Roundup. Bye.